The magic of traveling in the dome car is that it's so unlike traveling in a typical rail car. In a typical rail car, you're looking out of a sheet of glass and it's like a motion picture racing by outside the train. Here it's like IMAX. It's all around you. You can see from one end of the train to the other. You can sit up here and see the horizon in every direction. You can watch the signals change ahead of the train. In fact, many times you can see the train from one end to the other, and that's pretty unique.
The pleasure of viewing America from a dome car is hard to beat. However, another experience that comes close is taking a meal in the dining car.
The dining experience in the California Zephyr was truly a marvelous one. You had all the glassware, all the pottery, the china, every little dish from peas to corn had a little bowl for it, and they even had an Italian dinner at certain times on the train.
The California Zephyr came on the scene in 1949. In the mid-50s, railroads made their very last attempt to revitalize rail passenger travel. It's interesting to note that while some of the eastern railroads in the mid-1950s chose to go with lightweight trains, Santa Fe went the other way with heavier bi-level cars. These double-decker cars were first used on the El Capitan, an all-coach train. Eventually, the new double-decker cars replaced most of the low-level cars on all of Santa Fe's named trains, with the exception of the Super Chief. In 1956, Burlington launched what is most likely the last completely new train by any railroad, the Denver Zephyr. A few railroads purchased new cars, but not complete trains. Lightweight trains made a comeback in 1968 with the introduction of United Aircraft's turboliners, which ran between Boston and New York. By the late 1960s, the Pennsylvania Railroad, later Penn Central, placed into service new high-speed trains that ran between New York and Washington, D.C. They were called Metroliners. The first run was made on January 16, 1969. The Metroliners lasted until 2000, when Amtrak launched a new generation of high-speed trains called Acela Express. However, the number of rail passengers started to decline back in the late 1950s. Peter Hansen explains.
The railroads made a valiant attempt to hang on to passenger business after the Second World War, but they were just up against too much. Air travel had become much more accepted after the war. The war had in some sense helped to legitimize air travel. Also we were beginning to build the interstate highway system by the late 1950s. A lot of times we forget that it was really more the automobile than the airplane that cut into the railroad's passenger business. And then one other factor that came along a few years later was the demise of the railway mail service. By the late 1960s, the Post Office Department is making fundamental decisions about how they're going to handle the mail. Is it still a good idea for it to be sorted en route, or should we put it on airplanes and then truck it into the city and then sort it in a stationary location? There were still some very pro-passenger railroads who hung on really until the end, until the onset of Amtrak. And they did it because I think in some sense it was very central to their corporate image and to the way they saw themselves. In the East, certainly Baltimore and Ohio and Chesapeake and Ohio maintained standards that were almost as good as any in the country. The Florida railroads, the Atlantic Coast Line and Seaboard Airline, had top-notch service right to the end. The dining car service remained very good. They even had fashion shows on board, things like that. Western railroads in general treated their passengers a little bit better than Eastern railroads. Santa Fe probably stands out as the outstanding example of a pro-passenger railroad right up until the very end.
Well, I think the Santa Fe promoted passenger traffic right through the 60s. We had a very large, I think the largest passenger traffic department of any of the U.S. railways. We had a very heavy advertising campaign, advertising the Super Chief and the other trains, the El Capitan, the Chief, the San Francisco Chief, etc.
By the 1950s, passenger trains were in decline, partly because of a boom in auto ownership and expanding highways and aviation systems resulting from increased government investment. The private railroad companies were acutely aware of the trend as it was reflected in more and more red ink on their balance sheets, and more of these companies were sinking into bankruptcy. As railroads increasingly abandoned passenger trains, Congress intervened in October 1970, passing the Rail Passenger Service Act, creating the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, commonly known as Amtrak, to take over most of the nation's intercity train service. Amtrak began operations on May 1, 1971, initially using the train equipment that had belonged to the private railroads just the day before.
A few railroads chose not to join Amtrak and continued to operate their trains for several more years. Notable exceptions to joining Amtrak were Southern Crescent, and the Rio Grande Zephyr.
Some were skeptical of the Amtrak experiment, but oil shortages, increasing auto traffic, aviation congestion, and environmental concerns made the passenger railroad increasingly relevant. By the 21st century, Amtrak was carrying about 25 million passengers annually over a 21,000-mile system, serving 500 stations in 46 states.
While Amtrak did serve the general public nationwide, an idea was conceived to operate a luxury tour train. It would be called the American European Express, or AEE. Almost 24 railcars were purchased over the years. Nearly $1 million was spent on each car, not only restoring the car, but bringing it up to current mechanical standards. Stylish appointments were added, such as polished brass in the sleeping cars, plus ebony and brass in the club cars. In later years, the train was known as the American Orient Express and operated various tours around the United States, Canada, and Mexico. In 2006, the train was renamed Grand Lux Express to reflect new itineraries and new ownership. While the Grand Lux Express may bring back memories of rail travel of years ago, America's railroads enthusiastically promoted their passenger service, and for good reason. Peter Hansen provides an overview.
I'm not sure if the terminology existed back then, but the passenger train for many railroads was what today we would call a loss leader. It was an investment that the railroad made, hoping to garner business in more profitable areas. They knew that this was the area in which people would touch the railroad most personally.
The last 175 years have been exciting. We've gone from that little 1830s Baltimore and Ohio locomotive to the streamlined trains of the 1930s, dome cars in the 50s, now new full-length dome cars, plus commuter trains, dinner trains, and Amtrak today. The American poet Edna St. Vincent Millay expressed our love of train travel with the words, "My heart is warm with the friends I make, and better friends I'll not be knowing. Yet there isn't a train I wouldn't take, no matter where it's going." I'm Tia Marlier. Thanks for coming along for the ride on America and the Passenger Train.